Scott Peterson. For 4 months, he was the grieving husband. He stood in front of the cameras, he pleaded for the safe return of his pregnant wife, and he let an entire country watch a man seem to come apart in real time. At least, that is what the cameras showed. Because while Scott Peterson was asking the public to help him find Lacey, investigators had already begun pulling at a single thread that would unravel everything. And at the other end of that thread was a homemade concrete weight sitting in his warehouse. It was 1997 when Scott Peterson married Lacey Rocha. They had met at the university where they were both students in California. And to nearly everyone who knew them, they looked like the couple who had figured it out early. Scott sold fertilizer for a living in Modesto. Lacey was warm, easy to like, the kind of person neighbors remembered by name. By the end of 2002, she was about 8 months along. Expecting a son, the couple had already decided to call Connor. The nursery was coming together. The due date was set for the following February. On December 24, 2002, Scott told police he had left Lacey at home that morning and driven roughly 90 miles to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. When he returned that evening, he said she was gone. He reported her missing, and the search that followed pulled in volunteers from across the region. Prosecutors would later argue a very different version of that morning, that Lacey had been fatally harmed at home on the night of December 23rd or in the early hours of the 24th, and that her body had been weighted and placed into San Francisco Bay. What investigators did not announce right away was the second life Scott had been living. A massage therapist named Amber Frey had started dating him on November 20th, 2002, believing he was a single man. On December 9th, 2 weeks before Lacey vanished, he told Amber he was a widower, that he was facing his first holidays without his wife. 2 weeks before Lacey vanished. Amber went to the police on December 30th, then recorded a series of phone calls in which Scott told her he was traveling in Paris, while in reality he was standing among the crowds at a vigil for his own missing wife. She went public in late January. Then the Bay gave back what it had been holding. In mid-April of 2003, the remains of the baby washed ashore, and a day later, Lacey's remains surfaced about a mile away, both within sight of the water where Scott said he had been fishing. From there, the case became a study in circumstance, because there was no confession and no eyewitness. What there was a pattern. A search dog had alerted at the marina. There was concrete dust and a homemade anchor in his warehouse, with signs that more than one had been made. There was a strand of Lacey's hair found on a pair of pliers on his boat. And there were the lies, layered one on top of another. On April 18, 2003, officers stopped him near the Mexican border. He had dyed his hair, he was carrying his brother's identification, several phones, and about $15,000 in cash. What made the case so unusual was how little of it could be held in a hand. There was no weapon recovered, no scene that told a clean story, no single moment a witness could point to and describe. Prosecutors instead asked the jury to read the silence between the facts. Why had Scott quietly bought a small boat that those close to Lacey said she had never mentioned, only weeks before she disappeared? Why did tracking data placed on his vehicles show him returning to that same stretch of bay in the days after volunteers fanned out to look for her? Why, when the remains finally surfaced, were they within sight of the very water he had named as his alibi? The defense pushed back hard. A circumstantial case, they argued, was a thin thing to send a man to death over, and the person truly responsible was still out there somewhere. The jury did not agree. The trial was moved to Redwood City to find an impartial jury. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder in Lacey's death and second-degree murder in the death of their son. The following spring, on March 16, 2005, he was sentenced to death. For years, that was where the story rested. But on August 24, 2020, the California Supreme Court upheld the convictions while overturning the death sentence, ruling that mistakes during jury selection had compromised his right to a fair penalty phase. Prosecutors chose not to seek death a second time, and in December of 2021, he was resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He was moved to Mule Creek State Prison. In early 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took on his case, arguing that someone else was responsible and that new science should be allowed to speak. A judge permitted limited new DNA testing on a piece of duct tape tied to the case. That effort has not changed his situation. In 2025, a judge denied the petition, finding the claims either procedurally barred or without merit. The project said afterward that it disagreed with the ruling on every level. As of 2026, Scott Peterson remains imprisoned, and he still maintains he is innocent. One thing the case left behind outlasts him. The law that followed it, recognizing an unborn child as a separate victim, was signed in 2004, and it carried Lacey's and Connor's names. Scott Peterson built his alibi around being somewhere else. The next man would not claim he was 90 miles away. He would be standing right there when his wife died, the only living witness to what happened. And he would tell a story he had, in fact, told once before. Harold Henthorne. A husband and wife celebrate 12 years of marriage with a hike through one of the most beautiful places in Colorado. They leave the marked trail. Minutes later, only one of them is still standing at the top of a cliff. He says it was a terrible accident, that he looked away for a moment and she was gone. The problem is the map investigators found in his car, with one spot circled in pink. And the problem is that this was the second time Harold Henthorne had been the only witness to his wife's death. Harold married Dr. Tony Bertollet, an ophthalmologist, on September 30th, 2000. They had a daughter together. To the outside world, Harold presented himself as a successful businessman. But the reality was that he had not held a steady job since the early 1990s. He lived quietly on the proceeds of insurance. On September 29, 2012, to mark their 12th anniversary, the couple hiked into a remote section of Rocky Mountain National Park. They stepped off the established trail. Around 5:15 in the evening, Tony fell roughly 130 feet to her death. Harold, the only person there, gave accounts that did not line up. He said he had been reading a text message. He said he had been taking a photograph. His call for help came nearly 40 minutes after the fall, and rangers did not reach her body until around 8 that night. The closer investigators looked, the less the story held. Harold told rangers he barely knew the park. Yet prosecutors would later tell jurors he had made 9 separate trips there before that day, scouting that same remote, rocky area again and again. In his car, rangers found a map with a small pink mark, placed almost exactly where Tony had gone over the edge. A dispatcher who walked him through the moments after the fall came away, doubting he had ever performed the life-saving measures he claimed. And in the time around his wife's death, he managed to make around 22 phone calls and send close to 98 text messages, while telling people he had to hang up to save his phone battery. Then there was the money. Prosecutors said Harold was the sole beneficiary of life insurance policies on Tony totaling about $4.7 million. And no, I am not making that up. Estimates of the exact coverage ranged from roughly $4.5 million to $4.7 million across the policies. But the part that mattered was simpler than any number. Tony had no idea the policies existed. The payouts that would arrive the moment she died had been arranged entirely without her knowledge. And somehow, it gets worse. Years before Tony, in May of 1995, Harold's first wife, Lynn, died on a remote road when the vehicle they were working on came off its jack and crushed her. Harold was the only witness to that too. The tire that had supposedly forced them to stop in such an isolated spot turned out to have been only low, not flat. He had taken out more than $500,000 in coverage on her, and he collected around $600,000. People who pulled over to help that night said he turned them away. For years, nothing came of it. Investigators reopened the case in 2014, but no charges were ever filed in Lynn's death. There was also a moment that sat between the two deaths and took on a far darker shape in hindsight. In 2011, about a year before the fall, a wooden beam at a property the couple owned came down and struck Tony, injuring her. At the time, it looked like an accident, the sort of thing that happens around old structures. By the time of the trial, prosecutors were presenting it as something else entirely. A first attempt that simply had not finished the job. Because Tony died on federal land, the case belonged to the federal courts, and Harold was tried in Denver. It was an unusual trial in one respect. Prosecutors were allowed to walk the jury through not only the night Tony fell, but the death of Lynn 2 decades earlier, and the beam that had struck Tony the year before. 3 events that, standing alone, might each have passed as misfortune, but laid side by side told a single story. One prosecutor told jurors that Harold had scouted that remote, rocky area again and again before bringing his wife there. On September 21st, 2015, after roughly 10.5 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. In December of 2015, he received the only sentence the law allowed: life in prison, with no possibility of parole. He has spent the years since trying to undo it. A federal appeals court upheld the conviction in July of 2017, and the Supreme Court declined to take the case. He filed later motions, including a claim that his own attorney had sold him out and failed him at trial. Those were denied through the early 2020s. As of 2026, Harold Henthorne, now in his late 60s, is serving life at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Harold Henthorne pretended to have expertise he did not possess. The next man did not have to pretend. He was a physician, a man people trusted with their lives, and he understood the human body well enough to know exactly how to make a death look like nothing at all. Martin MacNeill. He was a doctor, a lawyer, and a former bishop in his church. The kind of man a community hands its trust to without a second thought. He told his wife she should have a facelift. He arranged for the medications afterward. And 8 days later, one of their children found her in the bathtub, gone. For years, it was written off as a medical tragedy. It would take 2 of his own daughters, refusing to let it go, to prove it was anything but. Martin MacNeill and his wife Michelle had been married nearly 29 years and had built a large family in Pleasant Grove, Utah. 8 children in all, 4 of them adopted. Michelle was a former beauty queen. Martin was, on paper, an accomplished man. Investigators would later learn that some of that paper was fabricated, including falsified records and a disability diagnosis he had invented for himself. In the spring of 2007, Martin pressed Michelle to undergo a facelift, then encouraged her surgeon to prescribe a combination of strong medications that he specifically requested. On April 11, 2007, Michelle was found unresponsive in the bathtub of their home. Martin had told one of their young daughters to go check on her mother. By the time help arrived, Michelle was gone. Prosecutors would later argue that Martin had used those medications to render her helpless, and that her death in the water was no accident, all so he could be with the woman he was seeing on the side. For days before the procedure and in the hours after it, the household ran on Martin's instructions. He had urged Michelle to have the surgery. He had asked specifically that she be given a heavy regimen of painkillers and sedatives once it was done. And on the morning she was found, it was Martin who sent one of their daughters to go and look in on her. To prosecutors, none of that was coincidence. Their theory was blunt. A man who understood medicine had turned it into a weapon, dosing his wife past the point of being able to help herself, and then arranging for her to be found in a way that pointed at anything except him. Most people never heard how quickly the rest of his life rearranged itself. The woman Martin had been seeing moved into the family home as a nanny only weeks after Michelle's death. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Within months, the two of them were tangled in an identity theft scheme that used the name and identity of one of Martin's adopted daughters, a young woman he had arranged to send overseas. When that scheme fell apart, Martin was sentenced in federal court to 4 years for the identity theft. The woman received 21 months. And still, on paper, Michelle's death remained an accident. What finally turned a closed case back into an open one was the persistence of his own children. The original autopsy had pointed to natural cardiovascular causes, and for a long time, that finding stood unchallenged. But two of his daughters, one of them a medical student, refused to accept it. They gathered records. They wrote to newspapers. They contacted the office of the governor. They pressed the county attorney until the case was finally assigned to investigators willing to ask the medical questions a second time. When the evidence was reviewed again, the state medical examiner reached a very different conclusion than the first. The combination of drugs in Michelle's system, he found, had contributed to her death, and her drowning was not the simple misfortune it had been called. At trial, which began in October of 2013, the prosecutor told jurors that Martin had very nearly committed a perfect crime. To put it plainly, a man with medical knowledge had built a death that was designed to be mistaken for an ordinary one, and for 6 years it had worked. On November 9th, 2013, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder and of obstruction of justice. He was separately convicted of an additional felony involving one of his adult daughters. In September of 2014, he was sentenced to 15 years to life on the first-degree murder conviction, plus 1 to 15 years for obstruction, and a further 1 to 15 years on the separate count. The terms to run consecutively, which meant roughly 17 years before he could even be considered for parole. He would never reach that date. On April 9th, 2017, a little more than 4 years into his sentence, Martin MacNeill was found dead in the Utah State Prison. A police report released that summer concluded that he had taken his own life. He had attempted the same while in jail years earlier, not long after his arrest. As of 2026, the case stands as it was left. A conviction secured, an appeal he did not live to pursue, and 2 daughters who got the answer the system had nearly let slip away. For the daughters who had refused to let the case close, the conviction was the vindication they had spent 6 years chasing. They had been told more than once that there was nothing there to find. The verdict, and the second look at the evidence that made it possible, said otherwise. Martin MacNeill's story collapsed under the weight of science, a medical examiner who looked again and saw what the first report had missed. The next case would also be decided in a laboratory. Except this time, there was no affair, no insurance windfall, no obvious reason at all. Only a husband, a quiet country road, and a story that the laws of physics simply would not allow. Todd Kendhammer. He called for help from the side of a rural road, his voice breaking, and told the dispatcher that a pipe had flown off a passing truck, smashed through his windshield, and struck his wife as they drove. It was a freak accident, the kind of thing that happens to almost no one. The trouble was that no one could find the truck. No one could find the pipe's owner. And when the medical examiner studied Barbara's injuries, they told a story that had nothing to do with a windshield. Todd Kendhammer and his wife Barbara had been married a long time. They lived in West Salem, Wisconsin. Barbara worked in a school lunchroom. Todd did windshield repair work on the side. The couple had recently marked their 25th wedding anniversary and had raised 2 children together. By every account available, theirs was an unremarkable, settled life, which is part of what made what came next so hard to explain. Just after 8 in the morning on September 16, 2016, Todd placed his call to emergency services from a country road in La Crosse County. He said a length of pipe had come off a truck in front of them, pierced the windshield, and hit Barbara. She was rushed to the hospital and died of her injuries the following day. That was the account he gave, and at first there was little reason to doubt a husband in obvious distress. This is where the story takes a turn no one expected. Because when the medical examiner studied Barbara's injuries, the physical evidence and the story stopped agreeing. She had died from blunt impact injuries to her head and neck that were inconsistent with a pipe coming through a windshield. She had a broken nose. There were scratches on her neck and a pattern of bruising that pointed toward a struggle rather than a roadside fluke. Investigators went looking for the truck that was supposed to have shed the pipe and never found it. They pulled surveillance from the area and found nothing that matched. They even staged controlled tests, trying to recreate the path a loose pipe would have to travel to do what Todd had described. And the scenario simply would not reproduce. Every time they ran it, physics handed them a different answer than the one he had given. The smaller contradictions kept stacking up beside the central one. Todd had told investigators he was driving that morning to repair windshields for 2 acquaintances. Both men, when they were asked, said no such plan had been made. He had fresh scratches and cuts across his knuckles, which he explained as the ordinary hazards of working with glass. And then there was the question that usually anchors a case like this, the one prosecutors could not answer. What comes next is the part that still does not quite make sense. There was no proven motive. No affair came to light. No money trouble surfaced. No history of violence in the marriage was ever shown. By every available measure, Todd and Barbara had been an ordinary couple, settled into a long life together. The prosecution built its case almost entirely on what the body and the scene said had happened, and it left the question of why for the jury to sit with on its own. In Wisconsin, that gap did not have to be filled. The most serious homicide charge in the state requires neither premeditation nor a proven motive, only proof that a person intended to end a life and did. Todd took the stand in his own defense and told the jury his version once more. The truck, the pipe, the windshield. On December 21st, 2017, after about 9 days of trial and somewhere between 9 and 10 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree intentional homicide. In March of 2018, the judge imposed the sentence the conviction carried automatically: life in prison, with eligibility for parole only after 30 years. His defense has fought on in the years since. In 2021, a new legal team, which included an attorney known nationally for his work on a widely watched case, brought a forensic pathologist before the court to challenge the medical findings at an evidentiary hearing. The judge was not persuaded, and the motion was denied. The Wisconsin Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction on June 6, 2024, rejecting a series of claims that his trial lawyers had failed him, and the state's highest court declined to take up the case later that year. As of 2026, Todd Kendhammer remains in prison, and his children continue to insist that he is innocent. Barbara had been 46 years old, a wife of 25 years, and a mother of 2. The kind of person whose absence gets measured in small, ordinary things. The empty seat at the table, the morning routine that simply stopped. The jury that convicted her husband was never given a reason for what happened that morning. And in all the years since, no one has offered one. Every man in these 4 cases was, in the end, an amateur. Each one built a single lie and gambled everything on whether it would hold. But not every man who staged a death was guessing at how an investigation worked. Some had spent entire careers on the other side of one, learning exactly how cases get solved, which meant they also understood exactly how to keep one from ever being solved at all. One of them carried a badge. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Drew Peterson. In 2004, a woman was found dead in her bathtub, and the people whose job it was to ask hard questions decided there were none worth asking. It was an accident. Case closed. Then, 3 years later, that same man's next wife walked out of her own life and was never seen again. And all at once, everyone wanted another look at that bathtub. By the time they were finished looking, a decorated police sergeant was facing the rest of his life behind bars. Bolingbrook, Illinois, 1992. Drew Peterson was a sergeant on the local police force, a man with a badge, a uniform, and an easy, practiced confidence, when he married his 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio. The marriage did not last. They divorced in October of 2003, and the split was anything but quiet. Money was still being divided between them, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Savio did something that would echo for years after she was gone. She told people, and she put it down in writing, that she was afraid of her ex-husband. If anything ever happened to her, she said, no one should be fooled into calling it an accident, because the person responsible would be Drew. That was a warning sign. The system did not act on it. On March 1st, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead in a dry bathtub, with an injury to her head and no water around her. A coroner's jury, which happened to include a man who knew Drew personally, looked at the scene and ruled it an accidental drowning. The timing was almost too clean to believe. She had died before the financial half of their divorce was ever finalized, which meant that instead of dividing what they owned with his former wife, Drew was now simply free of her. For 3 years, that ruling stood unchallenged, and Drew Peterson moved on with his life. Then, in late October of 2007, his 4th wife changed everything by vanishing. Stacy Peterson was 23 years old. One day she was home, and the next she was gone. And Drew's explanation was that she had run off with another man. Stacy has never been found. But her disappearance did something that Kathleen Savio's death never had. It pulled a national spotlight directly onto Drew Peterson, and it sent investigators back to a case they had closed 3 years before. Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed. This time, 2 separate forensic experts, including a nationally known pathologist, examined the evidence with fresh eyes, and they arrived at the exact opposite conclusion of the coroner's jury. Savio had not slipped and drowned. She had been the victim of a homicide. The injury to her head and the way her body had come to rest did not fit a fall in an empty tub, and the experts said so plainly. The lead prosecutor framed it for the public in a single, blunt phrase. This was a death, he said, that had been deliberately staged to look like an accident, and for 3 years it had fooled everyone who mattered. A man who had spent his career studying how crimes were solved, prosecutors argued, had used every bit of that knowledge to commit one and walk away clean. There was a serious legal problem, though. The most powerful evidence against Drew came from 2 women who could no longer speak for themselves, Kathleen and Stacy, both of whom had told other people that they feared him. Ordinarily, that kind of second-hand account is not allowed in front of a jury. So the state of Illinois passed a new law, one that came to be known informally by Drew's own name, that lets a judge admit the statements of a witness who cannot testify, when the defendant is the very reason that witness is unavailable. At his 2012 trial, the words of both women, carried into the courtroom by a pastor and a divorce attorney, were finally heard. On September 6, 2012, Drew Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. On February 21, 2013, he was sentenced to 38 years. For a man already in his late 50s, that was, for all practical purposes, the end. But Drew was not done making headlines. From inside prison, he tried to arrange one more death. Investigators discovered that Drew had attempted to hire the uncle of a fellow inmate to hunt down and end the life of James Glasgow, the prosecutor who had convicted him. What Drew apparently never considered was that the conversations would be recorded, and they were. Played back later in a courtroom, his own voice became the evidence that sank him a second time. On May 31, 2016, he was convicted of soliciting that murder, and a judge stacked another 40 years on top of the sentence he was already serving. That brings his combined sentence to 78 years. He will not be eligible for release until the year 2081. That's not a typo, by the way. He is currently held at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. In 2021, he filed a handwritten petition claiming his original attorney had failed him. And as of the most recent proceedings in Will County, no court has overturned his conviction. As of 2026, Drew Peterson remains imprisoned. He also remains, to this day, a suspect who has never been charged in the disappearance of his 4th wife. Stacy has never been found. Drew Peterson spent a lifetime learning how investigations worked and tried to beat one from the inside. The next man took the opposite approach. He made certain that on the night his wife died, he was hundreds of miles away, surrounded by people who could vouch for him, while 2 others did the thing he would not do with his own hands. Mark Sievers. By the time Teresa Sievers was found dead inside her own home, the 2 men who had carried it out were already on the road back to Missouri, leaving behind trash bags, a lockpick kit, and a thin trail of prepaid phones. But neither of those men was the reason she was gone. The person who set the whole thing in motion was nowhere near Florida that night, and that was the entire idea. Dr. Teresa Sievers was a holistic medicine physician in Bonita Springs, Florida. Warm, well-regarded, the kind of doctor whose patients felt fortunate to have found her. Her husband, Mark, presented to the world as a devoted family man. Beneath that image, though, Mark was staring down a divorce, and with it the very real prospect of losing custody of his children and a great deal of money. What he had, that most people in a collapsing marriage do not, was a financial incentive and a plan. Court records would later show the couple held 5 separate life insurance policies on one another, together worth more than $4 million. When Mark was eventually charged, his bond alone was set at more than $4 million, a number that quietly captured just how much money had been riding on Teresa staying dead. On June 28, 2015, Teresa flew back to Florida alone, ahead of the rest of her family. Arriving around the same time were 2 men who had driven the entire way from Missouri. One was Curtis Wayne Wright Jr., a longtime friend of Mark's. The other was Jimmy Ray Rogers. That night, the 2 men entered Teresa's home and attacked her, and she did not survive. A friend found her the following day. Mark, all the while, was far away in the Northeast, surrounded by witnesses, building the alibi he was certain would keep him untouchable. An operation this size, with prepaid phones and a cross-country drive, and a friend talked into doing the worst of it, left plenty of room for someone to lose their nerve and pick up a phone. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not until the evidence forced the issue. And the evidence was damning. Mark and Wright had used prepaid cell phones to discuss the plan, the kind you buy with cash and discard. According to the Florida Supreme Court, those throwaway phones only ever came alive after the 2 men traded a prearranged code word over their regular lines, a signal to move the conversation onto the untraceable devices. Over the years, some accounts of the case have claimed to know the exact word they used. The court's own opinion confirmed only that a code word existed, and pointedly never named it. Either way, the phones had quietly logged the rhythm of 2 men working very hard not to be heard. Investigators then tracked a rented car through its own navigation system, and the device laid the whole thing bare. A round trip from Missouri to Florida and back, timed precisely to the night Teresa died. Surveillance cameras inside a Walmart captured the 2 men calmly gathering supplies, trash bags, cleaning wipes, towels, and a kit for picking locks. And after Teresa's funeral, Mark himself was seen quietly disposing of computer equipment. Just when the case might still have come down to one man's word against another, the man who had done the actual harm decided to talk. Curtis Wright accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Mark, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and took a sentence of 25 years. With credit for the time he had already spent locked up, that left him on track to be released sometime in the early to middle part of the 2040s. His account, braced on every side by the phones, the navigation data, and the store footage, became the backbone of the case against the husband who had kept his own hands clean. Rogers, the second man, was convicted of second-degree murder in October of 2019 and sentenced to life. And on December 4th, 2019, Mark Sievers, the husband who had never touched his wife, was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The following January, a jury unanimously recommended a death sentence, and the judge agreed. The man who had built an elaborate alibi to float above all of it was sentenced to die. The Florida Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and his death sentence in November of 2022. But the case has refused to close completely. In October of 2025, at a post-conviction hearing, Rogers took the stand and told the court that Mark had played no part at all, that Wright had acted entirely on his own. One of Mark's former attorneys testified that he too had come to believe Wright, who he said had been infatuated with Mark, was the true driving force behind the whole thing. In February of 2026, the judge rejected the effort to throw out the conviction, and a request to reconsider was denied the following month. As of 2026, Mark Sievers remains on Florida's death row, still insisting that the men who drove in from Missouri acted without him. Mark Sievers stayed in another state and let other men carry the weight of what he wanted done. The last of these husbands did the work himself, and to be sure that no one would ever question it, he did it on another continent, in a place where the death was ruled an accident and the evidence was gone within days. Larry Rudolph. On the last morning of an African safari, a shotgun went off inside a hunting lodge, and a woman who had spent 34 years married to a wealthy dentist was fatally wounded. Her husband said it was an accident, that the gun had fired on its own while she was packing it away, and the local authorities took him at his word. Her body was cremated within days. The only trouble was that back home, the people who knew Bianca Rudolph could not make that story fit the woman they had loved. Dr. Lawrence Rudolph, who went by Larry, was a wealthy dentist from the Pittsburgh area who had risen to become president of one of the most prominent big-game hunting organizations in the world. He and Bianca had been married 34 years and shared a deep passion for hunting, the kind of trips that carried them across continents. To the people around them, they looked like a couple who had built an enviable life. What Bianca may never have fully understood was that, for the better part of 2 decades, her husband had been carrying on an affair with his own office manager, a woman named Lori Milliron. On October 11th, 2016, on the final morning of a hunting trip in Kafue National Park in Zambia, Bianca was struck by a 12-gauge shotgun blast and died. Larry told investigators he had been in the bathroom when it happened, and that Bianca must have set the gun off herself while fitting it into a soft carrying case. Zambian authorities ruled it a tragic accident. Within days, her remains were cremated, and whatever physical evidence there might have been was, for all practical purposes, gone with them. That should have been the end of the story. But a friend of Bianca's simply could not let it rest. Bianca had been a devout Catholic, a woman of routine and conviction. And this friend knew with certainty that she would never have wanted to be cremated. The marriage, too, had been strained for a long time, worn down by money and by Larry's affair. None of it added up to a careless accident with a gun. Within about 2 weeks of the death, that friend reached out to the FBI, getting word to an agent stationed in southern Africa that something about the story was deeply wrong. What the FBI found, when it reconstructed the shooting, did not match a woman zipping a shotgun into a case. Agents concluded that the fatal shot had been fired from somewhere between 6.5 and 8 feet away, far too distant for the position Larry had described. To test whether Bianca could even have caused it herself, investigators ran a study using 15 women of roughly her height, which was 5 feet 4 inches, and found that not one of them could reach the trigger of that shotgun while packing it the way Larry had claimed. The physical evidence, in other words, was telling the agents that Bianca had not been the one holding the gun. Then there was a conversation a bartender would never forget. At an Arizona steakhouse in early 2020, the bartender testified he overheard Larry tell Milliron that he had taken his wife's life for her. Larry would later insist he had said something very different, that he had merely been repeating the accusation other people were throwing at him. It would fall to a jury to decide which of those 2 men to believe. And then there was the money, which was substantial. After Bianca's death, Larry filed claims on 9 separate life insurance policies spread across 7 different companies and collected $4,877,744.93. He spent part of that new fortune on a $3.5 million lot in Paradise Valley, Arizona, for the woman he had been seeing all those years. Larry was tried in federal court in Denver because Bianca had been a United States citizen who died overseas. After a 14-day trial on August 1st, 2022, a jury convicted him of the foreign murder of a United States citizen and of mail fraud. Malliron was convicted of being an accessory after the fact, of obstruction, and of 2 counts of perjury. The court later heard evidence that she had helped obtain a powerful sedative before earlier safaris. On August 21, 2023, Larry Rudolph was sentenced to life in prison, plus a concurrent 20 years. He was ordered to repay every cent of the insurance money he had collected, along with a $2 million fine, and to forfeit assets on top of that, with his total penalties reported at somewhere around $15 million. Malliron had been sentenced 2 months earlier, in June of 2023, to 17 years and fined $250,000 after the court heard that she had helped obtain a powerful sedative ahead of earlier safaris. Larry has not stopped fighting the verdict. A federal appeals court upheld his convictions in September of 2025. He is serving life. Malliron is held at a federal facility in Marianna, Florida, and both of them are still pursuing appeals. As of 2026, the dentist who swore his wife's death was a terrible accident on a faraway hunting trip remains exactly where the jury sent him. These 7 husbands all built the same kind of lie: a death dressed up as an accident, a suicide, or a simple stroke of terrible luck. As of 2026, 6 of them are still behind bars, and the 7th died there. So far, every appeal that might have set any of them free has gone nowhere. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.